Okay, and we are back. So, welcome back. This is the second lecture of this particular model. So, here I'm going to go a little bit further into the first order conditions for the household, and then we're going to talk about the firm's problem, and then maybe go a little bit further. We'll see. So, first order conditions. As you can see, we have four first order conditions here, one for capital, one for labor, or really leisure. We differentiated with respect to leisure because that's a good thing for us, but leisure was in terms of labor. So we can see that because we differentiated with respect to leisure, but labor is a function of leisure, then having that kind of like flipped around will actually give us a rather interesting equation that we'll talk about in a second. So let's go through all of these one by one. So, capital. All right, so we got here the first order condition for capital. What this says is, this looks just like your Euler equation minus what's in the parentheses. So what's going on in the parentheses here? Well, what we have is an equation that's basically explaining the evolution of capital over time, or the evolution of consumption over time with respect to changes in capital investment. What that means is it's an Euler equation, but if you look at what's inside the parentheses, we have the real interest rate plus 1 minus depreciation. So what we see is that future consumption relative to current consumption is basically weighted by that beta term, which is 1 over 1 plus rho, which is our time preferences. And then it's also weighted by 1 plus the real interest rate minus depreciation. So if the interest rate is, say, 4% and the depreciation rate on capital is, 2%, right? We're getting 1 plus 0.02 because 0.04 minus 0.02 is 0.02. So that is explaining how how consumption is going to evolve sort of with respect to changes along like the capital dimension. Picture all of these being like different axes that we're interested in, right? So this is how consumption evolves over the axis of capital. Now, labor, or really leisure, what I have is WT over CT. So it is the wage rate, or the real wage rate, over consumption being equal to the elasticity of substitution between labor and consumption, theta, divided by 1 minus LT, 1 minus labor, right? So this is essentially, if we look at this is a labor supply equation that we're looking at. And we can tell it's a labor supply equation because, one, it's derived from the household's first order conditions. So if it's a set of first order conditions coming from the household, right, and the household determines how much labor they want to give to the firm, well, that's a labor supply decision. So labor supply comes from the household, or labor supply decisions come from the household. So this is a labor supply equation. Now for bonds, all right, this is the Euler equation for bonds. This is explaining how consumption is evolving over time with respect to changes in bond holdings. Now, this is pretty similar to the stuff with capital holdings, right? Except it's 1 plus just the real interest rate, 1 plus RT, rather than 1 plus R minus delta. So it's a little different, but then again, also look at the subscripts, right? So it's the expected future return in the first Euler equation, which was for capital, right? RT plus 1. That's the expected future return. And then if we look at bonds, well, that's the current rate of return. So because if you're looking at this, otherwise you'd be like, all right, why would I buy any capital whatsoever? If I buy capital, well, the return that I get is actually reduced by that rate of depreciation, delta. But if I buy bonds, then I get, well, nothing that's being reduced by delta. You have to look at the time subscripts, right? So the expected rate of return less depreciation is going to be different than the current rate of return, right? Because the expected rate of return would be like tomorrow's rate of return. And it's also, if you want to think of it this way as well, there's also a difference between these types of interest rates. If you think of it that way, the interest rate on capital may in fact be different than the interest rate on bonds, right? If you look at the yield on government treasuries, for example, right? That yield is not going to be the same as the yield that you would get by lending to a firm. So there are different interest rates that we could sort of think about going on here as well. Now, finally, there's money. Now, this really isn't very different than what you saw in the money in the utility function model. This is basically an Euler equation, only it's for money rather than just, other stuff. So we've got 1 over CT equals beta times all the stuff in the parentheses, 1 over CT plus 1 times 1 plus the inflation rate plus gamma over MT plus 1. So this is explaining the flow of consumption along the axis of money. And we'll get a little bit further into that later, but this interpretation in this model is exactly what it is in the money in the utility function model. Why? Well, because money in the utility function model is, in fact, a part of the real business cycle models, or the class of real business cycle models. So we're going to talk about capital. It's the Euler equation for capital. So yeah, RT plus 1's the marginal product of capital. So what you saw before, right, when you had to do the dynamic programming, get the Euler equation, you got this. Now, should make you feel better. In fact, you might actually feel a lot nicer because, you get 1 plus RT plus 1 or 1 plus RT plus 1 minus delta rather than this AT plus 1, KT plus 1 to the alpha minus 1. Actually, there should be an alpha in front of that AT plus 1. My mistake on that one, but it doesn't really matter here because, this isn't exactly stuff that you're going to be directly required to know. Which, of course, I'm sure makes you wonder, why the hell are you even watching this video? Well, you'll see why you're watching this video. Trust me, this is still important information. So this should make you feel a little bit better. And so the Euler equation, the model, says the household chooses to invest in capital up until the point where the marginal product of consumption today, or the marginal utility of consumption today, is equal to the marginal utility of consumption tomorrow, weighted by time preferences beta and market conditions RT plus 1 and 1 minus delta. So if RT plus 1 goes up, we save more, right? We buy more capital and we consume less capital today, right? So time to talk about labor or leisure, right? That first order condition gave me this guy right here. And what that meant was the wage rate times the marginal utility of consumption is equal to the elasticity of substitution of leisure for consumption divided by leisure. In English, it tells us an equilibrium condition in which the agent is willing to work. Because if we look at this, right, the wage rate divided by consumption, or the wage rate times the marginal product of current consumption, says that the willingness to work is in fact a function of our desire, our utility of consumption, or the marginal utility of consumption. So if the agent sees a high enough wage, right, they're going to want to work a little bit more in order to increase their consumption. So this leads to the idea of what's known as a reserve wage. Under the reserve wage, the agent doesn't want to work unless they're offered a high enough wage to do so. Think of it like this. If you got a cool job where you work in an office, make a lot of money telling people what to do. Okay, awesome. Now, I would like to think this is what the real world is like, but of course, I'm only just starting to get into the real world. Maybe your job's like this. I would assume this is what all fancy office jobs are like. What would I know? I am just fresh out of grad school, and I am also just freshly unemployed because I got laid off thanks to COVID-related stuff from my primary source of income, which is all sorts of fun. It's not at all, trust me. However, I am on the job market and presumably I will find. So anyways, let's say your boss wants to give you a promotion. Now, that promotion is going to mean a lot more responsibility, right? It means you have to make more important decisions. If you screw up, that company suffers a lot for it, right? If you're like a line worker, you're working, the manufacturing line or something, and you screw something up, okay, company loses a couple bucks. If you screw up like a whole batch, maybe the company loses a couple hundred, couple $1,000, something like that. But they're not losing like, this dangerously high amount of money, right? They're not suffering that badly. But if you screw up in a higher level position, like let's say you have a position of major prominence, right? And you screw up in the new job, well, of course it's going to piss your company off because they're going to be like, yo, we were doing fine, really, until you showed up. Thanks, a-hole. And, well, that's going to mean more stress in your life, right? Because having that possibility of really screwing up the company, if you screw up, that's going to scare you. That's going to kind of freak you out. So if you've got more responsibilities, you got more stuff you got to do, and the issue of potentially screwing up at work becomes that much more daunting, right? If the possibility of screwing up at work gets more daunting and it gets, a lot scarier, are you really going to want to take that same wage? Or even think of it this way. You get offered a promotion, but you just have to do more stuff, right? You have to do more work. Well, if you get a promotion and you have to do more work, why are you going to want to take the same wage rate that you were earning before? I mean, really, the answer is you're not, right? There's going to have to be something to incentivize you to want to move up, to get promoted. Now, we can go a little bit further into that later, I guess. So while the first order conditions for capital, bonds, and money were intertemporal, there is something interesting about the first order condition for labor. There's no T+1 in there. It's just T, right? There's no intertemporal link whatsoever, which means every single period the agent chooses how much to work based on what the going wage rate is. Now, we know this isn't entirely accurate, right? Some of the stuff that we see in the real world is, well, different than what the interpretation of this particular model would be telling us, right? We've got wage contracts. There's bosses who schedule you, and you really have no say in when you work. These are certain types of rigidities, right? They make the real world abstract from the real business cycle quite a bit, actually. And so we kind of think of this model as what we would have if the world were perfect, right? But it's not. In addition, it kind of looks bad when wages fall. So there's sort of like a downward nominal wage rigidity that is kind of preventing actual, not actual, nominal wages from falling. It looks kind of bad when they fall. Now, real wages can fall all the time because, well, the real wage will be sort of indexed for inflation. So if inflation goes up, the nominal wage rate won't change, but the real wage rate can fall. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's rewrite this condition here. So I get WT equals theta over 1 minus L times CT. Right, so the left-hand side of the equation is actually telling me what the reserve wage is. The right-hand side of the equation is basically the labor supply. In short, the household decides to supply labor based on the going wage rate and their preferences for leisure and consumption. Now, in the third first-order condition, bonds. Remember, it said this. What that means is that the agent is going to buy bonds until the marginal utilities of consumption today and tomorrow are equal, weighted by time preferences and the real interest rate on those bonds. Now, when I solved some stuff out with that first dynamic general equilibrium model, I said that that marginal product of capital in the Euler equation was actually in a decentralized system equal to 1 plus the real interest rate. Well, this is where that comes from. So I, in fact, wasn't lying when I told you about that. So, all right, cool. Good for me. Pat on the back for Jeremy. Woohoo! Let's talk about money. Now, the first order condition for money said this stuff, right? What does that say? What does that mean? Well, it means that the agent holds real money balances conditional on the marginal utilities of consumption weighted by time preferences, the interest rate, and the elasticity of substitution between money holdings and consumption. Okay, maybe better English would help. They hold money until they're indifferent between holding money or consuming more stuff. This is a money demand function, right? So this helps us determine the equilibrium in money markets. Now, we'll worry a little bit about money supply when we talk about governments, which come a little bit later. So to recap thus far, the household optimizes, and we get a couple of pretty important functions. We basically get like a capital supply equation. It's not exactly the best way to put it, but in which we supply capital to the firm based on market conditions. We get a labor supply equation in which the agent supplies labor to the firm based on the going wage rate. We get like a demand for bonds equation in which the agent buys bonds from the firms or governments based on the going interest rate on those bonds. And we get a money demand equation in which the agent demands real money balances based on their preferences for consumption and the inflation rate. The higher the inflation rate, the more money they will demand. But this is kind of only one part of the story because, well, next we need firms. So far, all we've done is optimize for the household, but there's no production in there, right? There is no production function in the household's constraint while they were optimizing. Why? Well, because it's decentralized. So the decisions that the firm makes aren't internalized in the household's optimization problem. They're actually done outside of the household's optimization problem in the decentralized system. So let's talk about the firm. Well, we assume that there's one representative firm, and the firm has access to the following production technology. So Y is equal to, or output Y is equal to AT, which is that source of technology shocks, times KT to the alpha times LT to the 1 minus alpha. So it's the input of capital to the power of alpha times the input of labor to the power of 1 minus alpha, right? So because they've got two inputs into this production function, they face two different costs, the cost of capital and the cost of labor. For each unit of capital that they use, KT, they need to pay an interest rate, RT. For each hour of labor they get, they have to pay a real wage rate, WT. So their costs, right, their total costs are basically RT times KT, right, the interest rate on capital, or the rental rate on capital, times the amount of capital used, plus the wage rate on labor times the amount of labor used. And they maximize their profits in this model. So remember, profit is total revenue minus total costs, right? So everything they bring in, all the money they bring in minus all the money they have to spend in order to produce. Right. Well, total revenue is price times output, right? If output is just the number of units in production, then if we want to know what total revenue is, it's the number of units that we make times the price of each unit. So if we were to maximize profit with nominal variables, right, this is what we would have. Where I've got PT times that stuff in the parentheses it's the production function, A times K to the alpha times L to the 1 minus alpha, right? So that's my total revenue, but then I've got to subtract out my total costs, right? Well, my total costs are the rental rate, the nominal rental rate on capital, minus the nominal wage rate on labor. So if I want to maximize profit here, what I have to do is first really think, what first order conditions am I going to want to get? Am I going to want 1? Am I going to want 2? Well, you're going to want 2, because as they're maximizing profit, what they're trying to do is they're trying to find the optimal inputs of labor and capital that will allow them to maximize their profits. So if I get a first order condition for capital, this is what I get. Price times the marginal product of capital equals the nominal interest rate, right? Another way we can think of this is the value of the marginal product of capital is equal to the nominal interest rate. And then I would also get price times the marginal product of labor equals the nominal wage rate, right? So again, the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the nominal wage rate. right? But these are nominal terms. Remember, we're more interested in real stuff, right? Well, if we divided both sides by PT, we will, in fact, get real stuff, right? Because, well, okay, I get just the real marginal product of capital equals the nominal interest rate over the price level. And then I'd have to do the same thing for labor, right? Well, cool. I would get the marginal product of labor equals the nominal wage rate over the price level. So if I were to simplify that capital R over P, the nominal wage rate over the price level, if I were to simplify that, that gives me the real interest rate. And if I were to do the exact same thing for the wage rate, again, that just gives me the real wage, right? Because the nominal wage over the price level is the real wage. The nominal interest rate over the price level is the real interest rate. So it says the firm's marginal products of capital and labor are equal to the real interest rate and the real wage rate, respectively. Right? So what we've done is we've really just maximized profit for the firm, which gives us a set of, hold on a second, I've got a little kitty in front of the screen here, conditions that we can use to get an equilibrium in the markets. Actually, hold on. Sweetie, I think you got to move a little bit. I think you got to move. You're kind of in Dad's way. You can sit on Dad's lap. Yeah, sit on Dad's lap. Right, so for example, what we could do, we could look at, well, like this right here, right? That's equal to the real wage rate. So if the marginal product of labor is equal to the real wage, right? But the real wage was also equal to the, well, basically the labor supply, the decision of how much labor the household wants to supply to the firm, right? Which is really basically just the reserve wage rate. Well, we get theta over 1 minus LT, theta over really NT, right? Theta being the elasticity of substitution between leisure and consumption, divided by leisure times consumption, equal to the real wage rate. So that means the labor demand for the firms equal to the real wage rate, and that can be set equal to labor supply from the household, which is also equal to the real wage rate. So we actually have an equilibrium condition in labor markets, which is this. Now, when I said that stuff about the centralized and decentralized solutions, right, if this were centralized and I had stuff with labor in here, basically what we would end up getting is a scenario like this where we can actually eliminate the wage rate, right? Because the wage rate's equal to those two things. If we knew what the optimal combination of labor and capital was for the firm, right, and we knew what the household's labor supply equation was, well, there's no need for the wage rate because basically we've already got the quantity of labor figured out. So if we find the optimal quantity of labor, then we don't need to know what the price of labor is because we found the quantity, right? And it's one of the things that has to do with this model satisfying both welfare theorems of economics, because the first welfare theorem would mean that we would need to solve this out in a decentralized format. The second welfare theorem means that we would be able to solve it out in a centralized format. And if both of them are satisfied at the same point in time, the centralized and decentralized solutions end up becoming the same. Now, this can also be done for capital, right? But there's something cool about this with capital, and it's that, well, the interest rate is the same for K and B, right? So, okay, maybe I made a little bit of a boo-boo earlier, but if we make this assumption, right, because this is actually more of an assumption than it was a boo-boo, if I assume the interest rate is the same for capital and bonds, well, then we end up having an indeterminacy of how the firm finances its project. So if we assume for a second that the RT in both of the Euler equations were the same, well, then that means basically the return on capital and the return on bonds is the same. And yeah, we get this indeterminacy of how the firm finances its projects. This leads to something known as the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis, and it states that it doesn't matter if the firm finances the projects by issuing debt, bonds, or equity, capital, right? So if the firm wants to issue debt, that means that they're going to sell bonds. So you'll get like bonds for a company, and those bonds will be repaid by the company at some interest rate. Or, right, if the firm were to issue equity instead, right, they issue stock and you buy that. Well, what this hypothesis says is that it doesn't really matter how the firm finances its projects, because the value of the firm, right, if the firm wanted to say if the owner of the firm wanted to sell the firm, then the value of that firm, if the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis holds, meaning the interest rate is the same for capital and bonds, and there's this indeterminacy of how the firm finances its projects, right? The value of the firm's unaffected whether they issue equity or debt. So that's kind of an interesting finding, actually, and that really has some interesting conclusions for macroeconomic analysis. But let's kind of skip past that for a second and talk about the government. Like, what's the government doing here? Well, basically exactly what they do in real life. Nothing. And yeah, now of course someone's going to be pissed at me that I said that. Bad joke. Seriously, it's because they don't do anything in this model. Right? Everything they do is exogenous in this model, meaning, yeah, they can tax and borrow, but it's not done in response to anything or anyone in the model. There's no endogenous response function for government in this model, right? And, of course, Ricardian equivalence holds, meaning the timing of government spending, government taxation, etc., does not matter on the margin. So they don't play really any serious role in this model. They don't have an equation in this model. They just kind of like exist. Now, as a short disclaimer, this doesn't say that government is bad. And I'm not teaching this to make you hate the government. This is just a very simplified model that assumes perfect competition, perfectly flexible prices, and that both welfare theorems hold. There's no role for a government to improve anything in the model because there's literally nothing to improve, right? Everything is at its absolute best possible scenario, its best possible equilibrium. There's no way to improve the equilibrium in this model by introducing a third party to do any sort of redistribution, spending, etc. Right? So we need to collect all the equations to get our equilibrium conditions. Right? So before we would just have like one optimization problem and we just sort of put all the equations together, which is kind of neat, but it didn't get the real point of dynamic general equilibrium across that well because, well, it just didn't. Like, it showed you how to do a bunch of math, but the point of optimizing separately and simultaneously wasn't really put forth. It wasn't really given, right? There was no way to really show you how this stuff was working. Part of it was I just didn't want to work through all that math, especially early on in the course, and scare you away because, well, you know, it's kind of good if I have students that remain in my class. But really the RBC model is a good indicator of what's really going on here, right? How all of these different markets are interacting in equilibrium. Because remember, first what happens is there's optimization, right? Households will optimize, firms will optimize, governments technically optimize. They don't really in this model, but in like more complicated models where the welfare theorems of economics don't hold, and there's a role for government intervention in the economy for business cycle mitigation. In that case, they would optimize. But they all come together, and that's what gives us a general equilibrium. So, oh God, here's all the conditions for the general equilibrium, right? So the first one is the Euler equation for capital, right, which is what you've seen before, except there's that LT to the 1 minus alpha in there for labor, right, because now the production function is not just a function of capital, it's also a function of labor. Next, we have the labor supply being equal to labor demand, right, so that theta over 1 minus LT times CT, labor supply, also determines the reserve wage rate, equals 1 minus alpha times AT times KT to the alpha times LT to the minus alpha, which is the marginal product of labor, which is equal to the wage rate. So what that says is your real wage in a perfectly competitive market is equal to exactly how much value your labor, one more unit of your labor adds to output for the firm. So, I won't really go too far into that because anything beyond that kind of turns more into like a political and philosophical debate. But according to this model, in a perfectly competitive system, the real wage rate is equal to your marginal product of labor. Investment is equal to, well, KT plus 1 minus 1 minus delta times KT. All right, so that's the law of motion of capital that you've seen in the past. YT, output, is a function of capital and labor. Right, so this isn't really all that different from what you've seen in the past, except there's just now that labor term in there as well. Now, equation 51 is the resource constraint, right? So that explains basically that output can't be exceeded by how output is spent, or in better words, output, which is income can't exceed the way you choose to spend income. Equation 52 is the Euler equation for bonds, right? Equation 53 basically says that the real interest rate is equal to the marginal product of capital, right? So if the marginal product of capital, you use one more unit of capital, right? The amount of output that contributes to the firm is going to be equal to the rental rate on capital, or the real interest rate. And finally, we have our money demand equation, which is really expressed through the Euler equation for money. So from here, we can talk about what each equation is and the role that it plays in how shocks will kind of propagate, or shocks will carry through the system. So let's talk about some steady states, right? So remember, the steady state was a dynamic equilibrium, right? All the variables are trending towards their steady states, right? There's a fixed point. There's one in particular we got to talk about, which is money. Now, in the steady states in this model, none of the real variables are affected by changes in the money supply. For example, if we looked at steady state output, right, where capital is expressed as like a capital labor ratio, right? Well, it's this, right? Well, oh wow, that actually looks just like the steady state for capital and the dynamic general equilibrium model that you saw earlier. Right, that first one that you worked out, that's the steady state for output for that. That's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, like, we had other stuff in the constraint, so wouldn't we think that that stuff in the constraint would be affecting the steady state for capital? Well, not so fast, cowboy. Here's why. All the stuff in the constraint, first off, was being added in. It was additive. So if that constraint is additive, then what's really happening is when we take derivatives of the stuff with the constraint, anything being added in that's not like attached, like multiplied by any of our real variables, right? Like money, for example, isn't being multiplied by any of our real variables. Bonds aren't being multiplied by real variables. Well, we kind of end up seeing exactly this because all that stuff differentiates down to zero. So steady state output, which is a function of steady state capital, which is what's in the parentheses, right? Steady state output is not a function of the money supply, right? There's no money in there at all. So the model exhibits monetary neutrality. And again, I will define monetary neutrality. A model is said to exhibit monetary neutrality if the steady state values of real variables are not affected by changes in the nominal money stock. But wait, there's more. Just like Billy May said. A model is said to exhibit monetary superneutrality if the steady state values aren't affected, or the steady state values for real variables are not affected by changes in the growth rate of the nominal money stock, right? So money is not in steady state output. So if it's not in steady state output, then basically what that means is, well, if you change the money supply, but it's not part of that equation, right, then nothing in that equation changes. It's totally independent of the money supply. So if you change the money stock, or like the money supply in levels one time, or really any number of times, right, you're not changing any of the real variables. But if you change the growth rate in money, well, that also doesn't change any of the real variables. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Now consider the Euler equation in the steady state, right? And flipping it such that basically now we've got this 1 over beta divided by the marginal product of capital less depreciation, right? This is equal to 1 in the steady state. So what this says is that if steady state capital is larger than the current capital stock, so the marginal product of capital outside of the steady state is larger than the marginal product of capital in the steady state, well, the right-hand side of that equation has to be smaller than 1. And the marginal utility of consumption would be declining over time. It would be optimal in this case to postpone consumption to accumulate capital and have consumption grow over time. Right? Basically what this says is that there isn't enough capital in the economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to consume less and save more. So we're postponing consumption, right, to accumulate capital, save, and then have consumption grow over time, because what happens is as we save more, right, we consume less today, but we get to consume more tomorrow. Right? So as long as this marginal product of capital is larger than 1 over beta, this process will continue. But as the capital stock grows, right, the marginal product of capital declines until eventually we achieve equality here. Now, the converse holds true as well. Consumption really only remains constant when the marginal product of capital less depreciation is equal to 1 over beta, right? And remember, 1 over beta is just 1 plus rho. So this basically says, as long as we are just as patient as what the market conditions are returning, then consumption will remain constant. Now, if the central bank were to increase the rate of money growth, leading to an increase in inflation, and it were to induce households to accumulate more capital, it would lower the marginal product of capital, which would lead to this, right? Well, households want their consumption path to decline over time, so they would increase their current consumption and reduce capital holdings. Right? So, okay, what does that mean? Well, if inflation goes up, households are like, okay, well, I'm going to get more capital. It's going to, return like this nice real interest rate. It lowers the marginal product of capital, right? Remember, the more capital you get, the less or the more the marginal product of capital declines. So that's going to lead to this condition where the marginal product of capital less depreciation is less than 1 over beta, or just 1 plus rho, right? And in that case, households will want their consumption path to decline over time, so they increase their current consumption today and buy less capital. So really, in short, what we're seeing here is the steady state capital, on the other hand, is independent of the rate of inflation. So when we're not in the steady state, right, there can be kind of an effect that we're looking at here, because remember, money demand was a function of consumption, which also showed up in the Euler equation for capital investment. But in the steady state, on the other hand, it's independent of the rate of inflation. So what is affected by inflation? Well, the interest rate on any asset that pays off in units of money at some future point is going to be affected, right? So the real value of the future units of money will be affected by inflation. It's reflected through the interest rate required to induce individuals to want to hold the asset. So consider the nominal interest rate an asset has to yield if it's to give a real return, RT, in terms of consumption goods. Right? The asset costs 1 unit of consumption in period T, and it yields 1 plus R units of consumption in period T plus 1. In units of money, this costs P units of money in time T. And since the cost of each unit of consumption in period T plus 1 is going to be PT plus 1 in terms of money, right, the asset has to pay an amount equal to 1 plus R times PT plus 1, the future price level. Right? So it's going to be affecting the units of money in real terms, right? The real money balances will be affected by inflation. Right? The nominal return is equal to this, 1 plus R, 1 plus the real rate, times PT plus 1, right, the future price level, minus the current price level divided by the current price level, right? This is essentially just a percent change that we're kind of looking at, right? Well, that's equal to 1 plus the real rate plus 1 plus future inflation. We can consider that like expected inflation. And if we subtract, we'll get RT, right? Why did I subtract 1 from that? Well, if you looked at the Fisher equation, right, 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus inflation equals 1 plus the nominal interest rate. So I just subtracted 1 from both sides, and I got this here. And that tells me in the steady state, right, if we have this interest rate that is time variant, 1 plus that interest rate in the steady state is equal to 1 over beta, right, which comes out to, remember, 1 over beta is just 1 plus rho. So 1 plus the real rate of interest is equal to how impatient we are. So if we've got, let's say, pi SS, which is the steady state rate of inflation, right, the steady state nominal rate of interest is going to be given by this right here. And what is this? Well, this says basically 1 plus the nominal interest rate in the steady state is equal to 1 plus steady state inflation divided by beta, or 1 plus the nominal rate in the steady state is equal to 1 plus pi times 1 plus rho. Now, if I subtract 1 from both sides, I isolate the nominal interest rate in its steady state, which is this right here. And the cool thing is this varies 1 for 1 with inflation. Right, so why am I looking at the nominal rate rather than the real rate here? Well, when monetary policy operates, right, when the Fed, for example, is engaging in monetary policy, the real interest rate is not their primary target. Right? Their primary target is the nominal interest rate. They want to affect the nominal rate of return on government bonds. Now, as they do that, they will be able to affect inflation by the Fisher equation, right? So if they can affect inflation, then technically, indirectly, and just about as indirectly as they're affecting inflation, they will be affecting the real interest rate. But when monetary policy is being determined, right, when the Fed comes out and they're like, we want to, cut the federal funds rate or the overnight lending rate between banks, when they want to cut that, that's a nominal interest rate. That's not a real rate. So they're controlling a nominal interest rate in hopes of controlling inflation, which then controls the real interest rate. Now, according to this model, though, what happens is, right, if you look at this, nominal interest rate in its steady state is equal to 1 plus inflation over beta minus 1. Do you see a real interest rate in there? No. So if it doesn't affect the real interest rate, right, in the steady state, it's not going to affect capital. It's not going to affect the way bonds are bought and sold because inflation is basically picking up the slack for that, right? So we're seeing nominal variables respond in a way such that real variables don't have to respond, right? So let's talk about some of Milton Friedman's stuff. So this is also going to kind of talk a little bit about the money and the utility function model again, right? Because in the money and the utility function and the real business cycle model, real money holdings would increase utility. So one would think that if the bank just printed more money, utility would go up, right? I mean, it would make sense, but no, wrong. The bank prints more money, it means more inflation. The utility function has real money balances, not nominal. It was real, which is adjusting for inflation. So higher inflation stems from increases in nominal money balances, not real money balances, right? Because the Fed can't control real money balances. They can only control nominal money balances. So it will actually reduce real money balances, which hurts the agent. Because if you go back and look at the utility function, right, it's real money balances. So if you wanted to put that into terms of nominal money balances, you could see that a change in the price level will reduce utility, which thus hurts the agent. This leads to a welfare loss for society, right? If you increase inflation and you decrease real money balances, then the agent gets hurt, right? The household gets hurt by inflation. that's a welfare loss. Excuse me. So it's not to say that inflation doesn't, like changing the nominal money balances, which affect inflation, it's not going to say that it isn't going to have some negative effects. Like, it's not to say that it doesn't do anything in this model. It does do stuff, right? But what's going to happen is, right, real variables aren't going to change because the change in the price level will pick up all the slack for that, right? Because prices can immediately adjust. Just if there is a shock to monetary policy, right? The nominal interest rate falls, real or nominal money balances go up, then just boom. Immediately, the price level responds. So the price level across all markets in the economy goes up by the perfect amount to offset the impact of monetary policy. But that doesn't mean that we're just like, it doesn't matter, like it's independent of prices, right? That's not entirely true. Because, well, increase in prices sucks. And it causes a welfare loss. One way that it causes a welfare loss is by reducing utility for the agent. So, in that case, right, if there are welfare implications for the inflation rate, it would imply that there's probably an optimal inflation rate that maximizes welfare for the economy. So if we ask, is there one? Well, the answer would be yes. And Milton Friedman, like I said last time, greatest economist ever, once said the private opportunity cost of holding money depended on the nominal interest rate. If Milton Friedman was a guitarist, he'd be this guy. John Petrucci is amazing. I love this guy. He's a guitarist from Dream Theater, if you don't know who he is. He's absolutely phenomenal, one of the best living guitarists. And by the way, that guitar is amazing to play. One day I'll get one, when I'm not an unemployed piece of shit. Now, according to Milton Friedman, the private opportunity cost of holding money depends on the nominal interest rate, R. Right? His logic was this. If you think of the nominal interest rate, right, which is the opportunity cost of holding idle cash, right, holding money, right, if that opportunity cost is also the marginal social cost of printing money, right, meaning the marginal cost that a central bank faces when they're printing one more unit of money. So, you print out these giant sheets of like $1, $5, $10, $100 bills, right? Let's just assume they're printing out units of currency that just there is like one bill, like so just $1 bills, right? They don't print anything else, it's just $1 bills. Well, if the marginal social cost of printing that with a fiat currency, right, basically which is a dollar is a dollar because the government says a dollar is a dollar, instead of being backed by like gold, silver, something like that, right? Well, the marginal cost of printing that money is actually pretty low. In fact, it's like so low, all you have to do is just put paper through a printing press, right? And when you do that, the marginal cost of putting one more piece of paper through the printer, well, it's pretty much zero. So if the marginal social cost of printing another dollar is zero, then the money market would be in equilibrium, right? Because we saw the money demand, right? But this is determining the money supply. So money markets would be in equilibrium if the private opportunity cost of holding money was also zero, right? So if the private opportunity cost is equal to the marginal social cost, which is equal to zero, right? Money markets are in equilibrium. Thus, the nominal interest rate is equal to zero because that's the marginal social cost of printing one more dollar, right? So when that's equal to zero, right, the private opportunity cost of holding money is also zero. That implies the nominal rate is zero, which basically gives us a welfare maximizing optimal quantity of money, right? Because remember, money is determined, the money in the economy is determined by the nominal interest rate. So if you were to affect the nominal interest rate, you'll be affecting the amount of money in the economy. So if we set the nominal interest rate to zero, right, that will ensure there is a welfare maximizing quantity of money, an optimal quantity of money, so to speak, that is in the economy, where money demand is equal to the money supply. Now, this would imply that by the Fisher equation, where it says the real rate of return is equal to the nominal rate of return minus the rate of inflation, right? If the central bank were to print money to the nominal rate is zero, then inefficiencies generated by deviations of the marginal social cost of printing money and the private opportunity cost of printed money go to zero. We have a case where the real interest rate is equal to a rate of deflation. So the optimal rate of inflation is actually a rate of deflation equal to the real return on capital. Now, with money in the utility function in this model, utility directly depends on real money balances. So we can think of this as the monetary authority choosing its monetary policy instrument, call it pi-SS, right, to maximize the agent's utility and achieve a steady state of real money balances to do so. Now, steady state consumption is independent of steady state inflation. I didn't work out the math, but if you're curious, you'd like to see it, let me know. I can do it. First order condition for the optimal inflation rate is achieved when the interest rate or the nominal interest rate is equal to zero. This rule is attributed to Milton Friedman, right? It's not actually the Friedman rule. The Friedman rule is a little different, but this a rule kind of attributed to Friedman in a way. Now, not everybody liked this idea. Well, Phelps in 1973 said money growth generates revenue for the government. This is known as the inflation tax, right? If you ever heard that inflation is a tax, this is how it is a tax, because if the government is printing money, right, well, that can generate revenue for the government. Revenue for the government, right, has to come out of, well, taxes, right? So by inflating, what's happening is you're actually seeing like a hidden tax on the consumer, right? It's a hidden tax because it's transferring wealth. Now, in this model, taxes were lump sum. They're non-distortionary, right? So a lump sum tax is basically just you add in that constraint just some amount that's going to be taxed, regardless of how much you earn, right? It doesn't matter if you earn, $1,000 a year or $100,000 a year, you pay the exact same lump sum tax. Now, that's non-distortionary because on the margin, right, your consumption savings decisions aren't going to change. Now, if it were a marginal tax, right, like what we see in the U.S., or if it were even a flat tax, right, where you just pay 10% of all your income or 20% of all your income, right, which tends to be like a libertarian argument for how like taxation should be conducted in the economy. Well, that's a distortionary tax. So both a like marginal tax rate system and a flat tax are in fact both distortionary because they're distorting the agent's consumption savings decision. Now, this model doesn't take that into account. It assumes that taxes are just lump sum, right? Again, another assumption of this model that may not actually be 100% correct, right? It's not true in real life at all. Now, according to Phelps, reducing the nominal rate to zero would imply that you get a rate of deflation equal to the real interest rate, means the government has to increase tax revenue through higher, like actual taxes, right? Higher lump sum taxes in this case. Now, that could generate inefficiencies through having to rely solely on direct taxation, meaning it may actually be optimal to have just a little inflation. Now, this is sort of saying that the government can tax, right? But there could be an inefficiency generated here because if they can only tax but they can't inflate, there could be a little bit of a problem. So it could actually be a good idea to have a little bit of inflation, right, to sort of change the way the government can collect money, so to speak. And so really the question now becomes, how does inflation generate revenue? And that is a question that we are going to answer in the next lecture video. So I'm going to end the lecture video here. It actually went a little longer than I wanted it to. I wanted it to be about 30 or 40 minutes, ended up being about 54 minutes. So the next lecture video is going to talk more about how inflation generates revenue. And until then, enjoy.